Hi guys, and welcome to lesson 1 of my brand new series, Everything I Learned in Photography School. I'm going to try and teach these lessons in an order in which they build upon each other from beginner to a bit more advanced. So since this is lesson 1, I thought we would start out pretty easy. Today, I'm going to teach you about your camera exposure settings, and by the end of the lesson, you should feel confident enough to shoot in manual mode and have full control over your exposure, sharpness of your images, and depth of field. I'm also going to give you some cheat sheets so you can refer back to them anytime you're not totally sure or you may have forgotten something. But it's really much easier than it seems, so let's jump right in. Let's start with camera settings and exposure. The first thing you want to master is how bright or dark your final image will be. This is called your exposure. Essentially, the more light you let into the camera, the brighter the image will be. But it can take a little bit of time to figure out how much light you need for different situations. Think of your camera and your lens like a little door to a house. It opens, lets light in, and closes again. The split second when it's open is when the exposure is made and your image is created. You control the exposure of your image by using these 3 settings together simultaneously: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Before we go in, here is the exposure triangle for you to have a visual and a little cheat sheet if you ever need to refer back to it. Aperture is the first setting in the exposure triangle. Aperture is like how wide the door opens to let light into your camera. It determines how wide your lens will open to allow light to pass through when you take an image. The amount of light you let pass through the lens is described as f-stop. So your aperture is your f-stop. The lower the f-stop number, the more open the aperture is, and therefore the more light will pass through and the brighter your image will be. For example, an aperture of f1.4 lets double the amount of light pass through in comparison to f2.0. So the image shot with an f-stop of 1.4 will be brighter than the higher f-stop. Aperture or f-stops vary with lenses. So different lenses will have different types of f-stops. Some lenses, for example, may only have a minimum aperture of f3.5, whereas a different lens may have a minimum aperture of f1.4. This is one reason why people have different lenses in their kits. So in the first example, I showed you how aperture can affect your brightness, but aperture also affects your depth of field. Depth of field is what makes you have a very nice blurry background or a super sharp focused background. The lower the f-stop, the more blurry your background will be. The higher the f-stop, the more sharp and in focus your background will be. The more open the aperture is equals the lower f-stop number. The more narrow the aperture is equals the higher f-stop number. To recap, aperture is your f-stop number. It affects the brightness and the depth of field of your image. The lower the f-stop number, the brighter and blurrier background you will have. The higher the f-stop number, the sharper and darker image you will have. The button or specific wheel you use for changing the aperture will vary from camera to camera, so just check in your manual to see how you do that. The second setting for exposure is your shutter speed. Shutter speed is like how slow or fast the door opens to your camera and lets light in. Your shutter speed determines how long the camera sensor will be exposed to light. It's measured in fractions and is usually a super short amount of time. The longer the shutter speed is, the longer the door stays open. The longer the camera is exposed to light, the brighter your image will be. Slower shutter speeds equal brighter images. Faster shutter speeds equal darker images. Movement also plays a role in shutter speeds. If you're photographing fast-moving objects like people playing sports or cars moving, then you want to select a very fast shutter speed to avoid blurring your subject. On the opposite side, if you're in nature photographing a stream and you want it to be a bit blurry, sort of hazy, then you would use a longer shutter speed, maybe even a few seconds. But in that case, you would have to use a tripod because as a general rule, you shouldn't really hand hold your camera on any shutter speed lower than 1/60. Because if your hands shake even just a little bit, your whole image can turn out blurry. To recap, shutter speed affects both the brightness of your final image and also the motion blur or sharpness of your subject. The higher the shutter speed, the sharper and darker your image will be. The lower shutter speed, the more motion blur and brighter your image will be. Again, like adjusting the aperture, this will vary from camera to camera, so you'll have to check your manual to see which button or wheel is used to adjust these settings. The third and final setting to control your exposure is ISO. ISO can sometimes, though, be one of the trickiest of the three settings because it does come with consequences to the actual quality of the image that you produce. ISO is simply a camera setting relevant to the sensor's light sensitivity. When you raise your camera's ISO, your images will become brighter. ISO can definitely help you take images in darker situations like at evening time. However, raising your ISO will increase the amount of grain or noise that you see in the image, and sometimes if you raise your ISO too high, it can render the images totally unusable. Grain or noise, if you don't know what that is the speckling that you see. It's the image quality. Every camera has a range of different ISO values, and some cameras can definitely handle higher ISOs much better than others. A common set of ISOs starting with a low ISO is 100, then 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, and at top 6400. When you double your ISO, you're doubling the amount of brightness that your final image will have. So for example, an image shot at 200 ISO will be twice as bright as an image shot at 100 ISO. You should really only try and raise your ISO if you can't brighten your photo anymore by using your shutter speed or aperture. To recap, ISO affects your camera's light sensitivity, the brightness of your image, and the grain of your image. A lower ISO will be darker and have less grain, whereas a higher ISO will be brighter but have more grain. Once again, refer to your manual to figure out how to change your ISO. When you use a combination of these three settings, you're able to determine how your final image will look, and it gives you full control over the brightness, darkness, depth of field, and sharpness of your image. Usually, depending on what you're shooting, you'll start by adjusting your aperture or your shutter speed first, based on what's most important for your shot. For example, if you're shooting a portrait and you want a nice blurry background, you would start by selecting your aperture, or f-stop. You would select the lowest f-stop number as possible so you could get that really nice blurry background. You would then move on to selecting your shutter speed, which you would have to bump up a little bit higher to compensate for the brightness of having a low aperture. Then you would select your ISO, trying to keep it as low as possible. In another example, if you're shooting a car or other fast-moving objects, you would want to start with your shutter speed by selecting a high enough shutter speed to keep your subject in focus. You would then move on to your aperture by selecting a low enough aperture to compensate for the darkness you've selected by your higher shutter speed. You would then move on to your ISO. You might have to raise it a little depending on the time of day, but again, you want to keep your ISO as low as possible. Of course, all of these settings are going to vary from scene to scene, whether it's light or dark. But if you compensate a light setting with a dark setting, or a dark setting with a lighter setting, you'll be able to find the correct exposure for your scene. I hope this was clear and you're able to walk away from this lesson feeling totally confident to control your camera settings and shoot in full manual mode for the best possible images. I would love to see you all on Instagram, and you can follow me at Gabrielle Ruddick, where I share more of my photography portfolio, work, and sometimes I have giveaways that are specifically special to Instagram. If you guys have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer in the comments below. See you next time.